Your Navy? Let me guess. Never been on a real mission. Those were the condescending words spit across the dinner table by my father-in-law's proud, arrogant friend, a decorated lieutenant colonel who assumed my uniform meant nothing. For years, I had stayed quiet, playing the humble background spouse while keeping secrets about my true past under wraps. But as the table fell into an uncomfortable, suffocating silence, an older, distinguished man sitting quietly at the head of the table leaned forward, narrowed his eyes, and quietly asked four terrifying words. "What's your call sign?" The room stopped breathing. The air inside the dining room smelled like roasted rosemary, expensive wine, and thinly veiled contempt. It was supposed to be a celebratory family gathering, a quiet milestone dinner hosted by my father-in-law to toast his old military buddies and catch up on family life. But sitting near the edge of the mahogany table, I already felt like an outsider looking in. My father-in-law, Robert, had spent the entire evening steering every single conversation toward prestige, status, and raw power. And tonight, he had brought along a special guest, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Vance. Marcus was a man who wore his rank like a suit of armor, sporting a crisp blazer and a posture so stiff you would think he was inspecting troops instead of eating appetizers. Throughout the first two courses, Marcus had made it abundantly clear where he stood. Whenever my own brief, quiet stint in the Navy was awkwardly mentioned by my wife to bridge a conversational gap, Marcus didn't just dismiss it, he actively weaponized it. He gave a sharp, nasal laugh that cut right through the clinking of silverware, leaned back in his chair, and looked down his nose at me with a smirk that made my skin crawl. The rest of the table shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact, while I forced myself to take a slow, measured breath and keep my mouth shut. Little did Marcus know, my silence wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the calm before a very heavy storm. Most people see a uniform and assume they know the entire story, reducing years of sacrifice down to a neat little box. They see a clean rank and think it defines the limits of your capability. What they never see are the endless nights on a pitching deck, the freezing salt water stinging your eyes, or the split-second decisions made when failure meant never coming home again. I had never been the kind of person to brag about my service. To my in-laws, I was just the quiet, ordinary spouse who kept a low profile and avoided rocking the boat. They had no idea about the classified deployments, the high-stakes operational briefings, or the sheer adrenaline of flying into pitch-black skies where every instrument panel glowed with warning lights. I kept that locked away because true operators don't need validation from civilians at a dinner table. But letting them mistake my humility for weakness? That was a mistake they were about to regret. The tension at the table ratcheted up a notch when Marcus decided to turn his casual condescension into a full-scale public cross-examination. He raised his wine glass, caught the attention of everyone at the table, and steered the spotlight right back onto me with a sharp, mocking glint in his eye. "So, tell me again, son," Marcus drawled, his voice dripping with condescension as he emphasized the word son. "You're Navy, right? Logistics? Desk jockey? Let me guess, you spent your entire enlistment pushing papers behind a safe perimeter, never even sniffed a real mission, let alone combat. Am I close?" A suffocating silence slammed over the dining room. My wife froze, her fork hovering halfway to her plate, her eyes darting nervously between Marcus and me. My father-in-law gave an approving, smug chuckle, clearly amused by his friend's sharp tongue. Every eye at the table turned to me, waiting to see how the quiet background spouse would shrink under the pressure. I kept my face entirely neutral, slowly setting down my napkin, but inside, the engine was finally revving up. Before I could open my mouth to answer, the heavy, suffocating silence of the dining room was shattered by the distinct, deliberate clink of silverware hitting fine china. Every head turned toward the head of the table. Seated there was a man who had remained almost entirely invisible all evening, an older, distinguished gentleman in his late 60s with sharp, penetrating gray eyes and a tailored jacket bearing subtle, undeniable insignia that commanded instant absolute authority. He hadn't touched his wine all night, but now he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, fixing his unblinking gaze squarely on Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Vance. The air in the room instantly grew ice cold as the quiet stranger prepared to speak. Marcus offered a patronizing, dismissive smile, assuming the older gentleman was just another retired civilian friend of the family who didn't understand military life. But before Marcus could brush him off or steer the conversation back to his own inflated accomplishments, the stranger raised a single hand. The room went dead silent. The older man locked eyes with me, a flicker of profound recognition crossing his weathered face, and quietly asked four terrifying words. "What's your call sign?" I held his gaze, let out a slow, controlled breath, and gave the only answer that mattered. "Ghost Rider, sir." The moment those words echoed across the room, the color drained completely from Marcus's face, his smug smirk vanishing, as if it had never existed. The heavy silence became suffocating. The older gentleman was not just some random guest. He was retired Fleet Admiral Arthur Vance, a legendary commander whose name carried immense weight across every branch of the armed forces. As the Admiral slowly stood up from the head of the table, the entire power dynamic of the room inverted in a single second. My father-in-law sat frozen, his jaw slack, finally realizing that the quiet, unassuming background spouse he had spent the entire evening looking down upon was someone whose operational history commanded absolute respect from the highest levels of the military. The rest of the evening unfolded in a delicious, heavy silence that spoke volumes, without a single word being uttered. Marcus sat frozen in his seat, staring down at his plate, completely humiliated as Admiral Arthur Vance nodded to me with a deep, respectful acknowledgement of the sacrifices and dangerous missions we had shared back in the day. My father-in-law wouldn't even meet my eyes, suddenly realizing how foolish it is to judge a book by its cover or a spouse by a quiet demeanor. I didn't gloat, and I didn't need to raise my voice. I simply finished my meal with quiet dignity, knowing that true strength never has to shout to be heard. When my wife and I finally drove home, the air between us had completely changed. She looked at me not just as her husband, but with a brand new, jaw-dropping realization of who I really was. Some lessons take a lifetime to learn, but respect, once earned through real actions rather than hollow boasting, lasts forever.